President Mary McAleese described the position of Roman Catholics in Northern Ireland as being similar to inmates of a concentration camp. Would the panel have any comment on that?
President McAleese compared the experience of Catholics in Northern Ireland to inmates in a concentration camp. When was that? When she was visiting Poland. Anybody want to begin there? Tom?
I think one always has to be very mindful of not really underscoring the sense of the enormous sense of hurt and murder that went on in, I take it you mean German concentration camps. I'm not, but of course, one must remember that, of course, it was the British who invented concentration camps, particularly during the Boer War. But I do feel there was a sense in the Northern Catholic population of being trapped in a political system where they were unable to make any headway. And I think my sense of that sense of being uprooted and the sense of violence aimed at them and the sense of being imprisoned in a political system where they had no way of breaking out of. I think that was very, very deep in the Northern Catholic population. But I just have to be careful that we don't actually in any way undercut the very idea of the enormity and the tragedy of the German concentration camp system. I think we have to be sensitive about that.
Okay. Darragh, would you like to comment on that?
I'm not actually sure that it was that's a literal quote from President McAleese, but notwithstanding that, perhaps I should, I think there's an essential difference here in the way that people look at their past. Obviously, in terms of people coming from a unionist or loyalist background, any allusion to the German sort of concentration camps is carries a lot more baggage than it does on perhaps the other side of the community. My own sense growing up, and I actually grew up in a nationalist background in Clonus. My father's family came from Portadown. My father's older brother and sister were both born in Portadown, but my grandparents moved in 1920 to Clonus. So, but growing up, I knew, like a lot of the family, that with educational opportunities and employment prospects, they were shepherded away from Northern Ireland simply because it was felt that in medicine or various other fields that they were going into, that the opportunities might be better elsewhere. So.
Yes. I mean, I'm not sure I've ever heard that quote directly. I know there was controversy over a speech by Mary McAleese in Poland. But I mean, effectively, I think one of the tragedies was, if you look at the 1920-21 settlements, north and south, although the southern Protestant population unfortunately declined through the decades, largely due to the Nate Temere decree, although there was an initial post-partition kind of surge in immigration to Britain or indeed to the north. But they did retain a presence in the Oireachtas, for example, through the Irish Senate down to 1936. It was removed by De Valera because he felt it had too much power, and he replaced it by very much something which was a mirror image of the Dáil, which was unfortunate. But there was that system of checks and balances in the independent Irish state, factored in by the 1920 Act, the fact that the Senate first appeared there as something which would reflect minorities, and in particular the Protestant minority in the 26 counties. That didn't apply in the new Northern Ireland state, and Joe Devlin pleaded with Lloyd George and the sort of huge majority of a Tory Liberal coalition in 1920 for a similar system whereby if partition had to happen, and of course he opposed it, but at least there should be, if you like, a system of checks and balances, which would mean that the nationalist one-third of the population would have some impact governmentally in the administration through a Senate. In the end, of course, the Northern Senate was simply elected by the Northern Ireland House of Commons by PR, and therefore really had only never more than 3 or 4 nationalists in it and was of no great significance at all. Whereas the Southern Senate actually passed something like 22 acts during the period and actually amended something like 1,200 pieces of legislation, which gave people like J.H. Campbell, Lord Glenavy, people like Yeats, people like the aristocracy and Church of Ireland Episcopal figures who were in the Irish Senate, an influence over legislation. I'm not saying that there wasn't discrimination, but at least that provided that system of safeguards. Perhaps the history of this state would have been different if there had been that system of safeguards from the beginning. And we think too of the lost opportunities of, say, the Craig-Collins Pact of 1922, the only attempt until really the 1990s to address the question of a police force acceptable to, broadly the entire community. That was addressed in 1922 in the provisions of the March 1922 Pact. It looked at the fact that there was an underrepresentation of Roman Catholics in the police. There was nil Catholics in the Ulster Specials, yet there were 32,000 of them. Now, that wasn't really continued to be acted upon, and that was a great opportunity lost. So when you use phrases like concentration camp, of course, it's an extreme phrase and it's a caricature. But certainly after 1922, there was a sense, as somebody who studied the history of Northern nationalism and the nationalist minority north of the border, there was a sense that they became a kind of a state within a state. They had their own schools. They had their own hospital in the Mater Infermorum Hospital. They had their own newspapers. They had their own cultural activities, their own Irish language, their own GAA, their own constant focus on Dublin. And from 1932, De Valera, somebody who would deliver them. And in many ways, it's, I suppose, a major kind of criticism of the Northern Ireland state and the governments in power that after 1948 you had an acute hospital in Belfast, the Mater Hospital, which catered for all sections of the community, which was an acute teaching hospital, which was not recognised by the state. So if you took a heart attack on the Crumlin Road, the ambulances rushed you to a hospital which is not recognised as a hospital, where surgeons who were on half salaries operated on you to save your life, and it was supported by a football pool. And it took 30 years, from the late 1940s, to negotiate a way for the Mater Hospital to join the health service, despite the fact that in England, denominational hospitals were the norm, whether they be Anglican or Baptist or Roman Catholic. The state would simply, buy a certain number of beds and help to support the hospital. But despite recommendations of the Tanner Report in 1955, there was no will under the Brookborough regime to deal with that. It was events like that that built up this kind of resentment and reinforced that state within a state until finally, of course, the modernisation process, which was induced by welfarism, by the 1947 Education Act, was to produce that educated class in the 60s and in a very changed climate. Television, American civil rights, labour in power. You suddenly had the civil rights movement and the dam sort of burst. But you look at the lost opportunities of the locust years.